What's going on, vinyl community? Welcome to another video with the record spinner, and things are about to get spooky because in today's video I'm going to be showcasing some albums to get into spooky season and Halloween from my vinyl collection. The month of October is upon us, which means it's time to embrace and enjoy horror films, haunted hay rides, trick-or-treating, colder weather, flannels, pumpkin spice, you name it. That time of year is now. Now, I do have to give some credit where it is due, and it's thanks to my girlfriend Abby, who gave me the initial spark to make this video because she loves Halloween and spooky season, and I got to thinking that I never really did a seasonal video for this time of year, so I figured better now than never. Now, I couldn't have kept this concise and just pick 5 albums, so I picked a total of 10 albums, some soundtracks, and general albums that tie in with the season quite well. Now, full disclaimer, I emphasize that these are albums from my vinyl collection, so there are no Misfits or Michael Jackson Thriller in this video. Those are some obvious picks that I'm sure some other people would choose, but I don't have them in my collection, so I won't be showcasing them in this video, so please be nice to me in the comment section. There is a lot to get through, so enough of the chit chat. Let's jump into what this video is all about. First, we'll focus on some soundtracks, and this one is for a film adaptation of a stage musical that's still being staged 50 years from when it initially debuted, and that is, of course, the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It tells the story of a newlywed couple getting lost in a storm and stumbling into the home of the transvestite mad scientist, Dr. Frankenfurter, who unveils his latest Frankenstein-style creation, Rocky. It draws plenty of inspiration from horror and science fiction B-movies, and perhaps was ahead of its time for exploring concepts such as androgyny, sexual liberation, and gender fluidity. And to say it's mildly campy is an understatement, because I feel this film and soundtrack has all of the 70s camp one could fathom. And these days you can go to any theater during Halloween and they're either showing the film or there is a shadow cast acting out the film as it plays, with plenty of audience participation to go around. Now we are going to hark back into my childhood as well as the childhood of many with It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. This animated special focuses on the Peanuts gang celebrating Halloween while Linus waits in a pumpkin patch for the mythical Great Pumpkin. This animated special was integral for influencing future Halloween-centered specials to come of other shows, and was watched by half of America when it was debuted back in 1966. So it's definitely a big piece of mid-1960s American pop culture, and it was televised every year up until 2020 when it became a streaming exclusive. And I remember having the VHS tape of this, and I always still tuned into ABC or whatever channel that would broadcast it when I was growing up. And if you remember it vividly, then you can enjoy the score by Vince Guaraldi, who also composed the classic Charlie Brown Christmas album on this die-cut pumpkin-shaped album. Next up, we have a soundtrack for the most influential horror film of all time, and this has a slight crossover tie with an album that already existed on its own plane, and that's the soundtrack to The Exorcist, a film adaptation based on William Peter Blatty's novel about a young child being possessed by demons and 2 priests trying to exorcise them out. There was no other film like this at the time, and to think that that was extreme by 1973 standards is astonishing given how far the genre of horror in cinema has come over the decades. Now, for as hair-raising as this film was and still is, a small part of its strength lies in the soundtrack, and that's thanks to Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells. Director William Friedkin wanted a piece of music that was childlike, and he felt that the opening segment of Tubular Bells best suited it. Now, for as much as this album should be highly regarded for reasons I won't get into in this video, this album took off due to its exposure in the film, so much that it earned the subtitle Theme of the Exorcist. Outside of that, the score has a very avant-garde approach with little snippets of orchestral swells and soundscapes that brew with scary intensity. Definitely not an album to listen to in the dark, but it creates a spooky atmosphere effortlessly. Next up is a soundtrack for a TV show that isn't necessarily Halloween centered, but has an element of horror depending on the case the show focuses on, and that is the soundtrack to Unsolved Mysteries. This is one of my favorite TV shows, and it delves into real life cases that have remained at most times unsolved, whether it's down to paranormal sightings, murders, lost loves, etc. Gary Malkin is responsible for providing the show's score, which is all synthesizer driven, and for the most part very dark and ambient sounding. Put it to you this way, if Brian Eno went goth, then you would have something like this. For as much as I love watching this show all throughout the year, watching it in the fall is even more well suited, and it's good to sprinkle in some episodes in between all the horror flicks viewed around this time of year. Next up is a soundtrack for a film that certainly has its cult status, gets a mandatory viewing from me this time of year, and while it is a soundtrack, it stands very firm on its own as an album, and that's the soundtrack for Trick or Treat. The film itself is about an outcast teenager who is obsessed with this rock star named Sammy Kerr, who dies in a hotel fire, into which he appears on the cover, and courtesy of a local radio DJ played by Kiss's own Gene Simmons, the teenager gets Sammy's unreleased album and starts playing it backwards, and a lot goes down leading up to Halloween night when Sammy comes back from the dead. It's a fun 80s comedy horror flick, and to provide some comedic relief, Ozzy Osbourne plays a television evangelist in the film. The band Fastway provided the soundtrack, which was of course the brainchild of Motorhead's Fast Eddie Clarke and UFO's Pete Way, and outside of it being a soundtrack, it stands out on its own as a solid 1980s hard rock metal album. Now that we got soundtracks out of the way, let's take a look at some rock albums. An obvious pick that came to mind when it came to doing this video was Welcome to My Nightmare by Alice Cooper. This was Alice's first solo album after the Alice Cooper group disbanded. He got back together with producer Bob Ezrin, and together they made this concept album about a string of nightmares had by this young boy named Steven. It has many staples such as the title track, Department of Youth, Only Women Bleed, and Escape, but what gives this album an authentic touch of horror is Vincent Price when he does the spoken word dialogue in Devil's Food before the Black Widow. Even tracks like Years Ago and Steven, while eerie and full of suspense, they are truly cinematic and keeps you locked in within the album's concept. Genuinely one of the spookiest rock albums ever, and probably the best Alice Cooper solo album, and with this being his first proper one, it's been very hard to top it since. Next up is Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls by Coven. I did a video a while back on my channel talking about rock music and the occult and who exactly did it first, and I have to say these guys have the heavy hand for pioneering the integration of occultism, witchcraft, and Satanism into rock music, and being the first, long before Ronnie James Dio or Gene Simmons, to use the sign of the horns, upside down crosses, and all that stuff. With these guys, it was a case of they portrayed what they practiced, whereas bands like Black Sabbath sang about the darker side of life but never dabbled into the black arts. And maybe it's because of Coven's intent, coupled with the countercultural satanic panic stuff going on at the tail end of 1969, that this album got pulled from circulation and earned its cult following. It's funny because for as much as the metal community sort of looks up to this album and band, the music is more so in the psych vein. I kind of see it as an occult version of Jefferson Airplane. The songs on this album are cool and witchy to say the least, and if you ever feel superstitious, you might not want to play the Satanic Mass on the B-side. Next up is Off the Bone by The Cramps. This is a collection of all the group's early singles and EPs released through the Vengeance, Illegal, and IRS labels. Some of the original highlights on here are Human Fly and Garbage Man, and they definitely take tabs from the old rockabilly textbook with renditions of Surfin' Bird and The Way I Walk, but most famously they also do Goo Goo Muck, which became more widely known due to its inclusion in the Wednesday series on Netflix. The Cramps often dubbed what they did as psychobilly, which can be seen as rockabilly with a gothic twist, which can sort of cross over into horror punk territory amongst obvious contemporaries like the Misfits. If you're looking for a solid primer on these guys and something to get spooky to, this compilation is the way to go. Next up is the self-titled and sole album of the Black Bells. This band was the vehicle for musician and songwriter Olivia Jean, who submitted a demo to Jack White when he started Third Man Records in 2009, and some 13 years later would go on to become Mrs. Jack White, but that's a whole other story. Olivia joined forces with musicians Shelby Lynne and Ruby Rogers, thus the Black Bells were born, and they did this fun album that really hones in on garage rock with a gothic twist, and the cover has a cool witchy vibe to it. Hell, you should see the alternate cover of the colored vinyl variant. That's even more hardcore looking. Even though they did only this album and a handful of singles, they did manage to pick up some traction with their first single, What Can I Do, which was used as the theme song for Elvira's movie Macabre, a fitting crossover since the two entities almost go hand in hand, and they did some guest spots with Stephen Colbert. It's a little bit of a deeper dive in the arsenal of Halloween rock, but it's a great album and you should definitely seek it out for yourself. Last but not least, I gotta talk about my favorite band and somehow tie them in with this concept. Yes, people around the world every year dress up as them for Halloween, yet they never really did a Halloween album or scary songs, but when you see what I chose, it'll make sense, and that's Destroyer by Kiss. What does this album have to do with Halloween? 4 words: Paul Lynde Halloween Special. This variety special starred Paul Lynde alongside the original Wicked Witch of the West, Witchy Poo, Pinky Tuscadero, Florence Henderson, and the Osmonds. If you want to watch a time capsule of 1976, that special will do it for you. It's on YouTube. Check it out for yourself. Kiss appeared on the special where they lip-synced to Detroit Rock City, Beth, and King of the Nighttime World, all of which appear on this album. And while they did TV shows in the past, such as ABC's In Concert, The Mike Douglas Show, and Midnight Special, this appearance on primetime television subjected them to a much bigger audience and was the initial spark that cemented Kiss into 1970s Americana. And the rest, as they say, is Kisstory. So there you guys go. Those are 10 albums to get into spooky season and Halloween from my vinyl collection. What are some albums that you guys like to listen to during this spooky time of year? Please drop a comment down below. I'd love to know. And if you want to hear some of these records and more, be sure to tune in to the Spooky Sounds broadcast of my Untracked Groove series on Sunday, October 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead, give it a like, and subscribe to the channel. See you guys in the next video, and most importantly, keep the records spinning.